Welcome to Boring Bedtime History. Tonight, we gently drift into the distant echoes of the medieval world, not through drama or noise, but through the quiet facts of what actually happened in a medieval battle. No heroic speeches, no clashing steel, just soft truths, slowly told. Let your thoughts wander, and let history lull you to sleep. Before any sword was drawn, there was quiet. A silence not born from peace, but from the weight of anticipation. The land, still dark with the final hours of night, lay blanketed in a thin fog that hugged the earth and softened the edges of everything. Far from the noisy clash we often imagine, the eve of a medieval battle was often marked by stillness. A deep, heavy stillness filled with tension and breath. In the distance, the dim flicker of campfires dotted the hillsides. Small orange glows pulsed like sleepy stars against the darkened fields. Men huddled around them, cloaked in wool and leather, warming their hands and murmuring in low voices. The fire cracked softly, and now and then, someone would shift their weight on a log or stir a pot of thin stew. There were no songs, no laughter, just the occasional clink of a ladle against a tin bowl, or the creak of a wooden cartwheel rolling slowly over uneven earth. The army had been marching for days. Blisters had formed under the boots of many of the foot soldiers, who were mostly simple men, farmers and tradesmen pressed into service. Their feet were wrapped in rough cloth, and some carried nothing more than a sharpened stick or a rusted old axe passed down from a grandfather who once fought in a war long forgotten. The nobles, better equipped and riding horses, kept to their own section of the camp, speaking in hushed tones under larger tents, guarded by loyal squires and pages. Some men prayed, whispering Latin phrases they did not fully understand, their fingers fumbling over wooden rosaries. Others sat alone, sharpening blades with stones, not out of need, but from the comfort of repetition. Each scrape against the blade gave their thoughts something to cling to. For many, this would be their first battle. The stories told by old veterans had filled their heads with images of glory and horror in equal measure. But no tale could match the feeling in the gut, the cold, hollow ache that came with knowing tomorrow might bring death. The captains walked slowly between the tents, checking on their men, offering words that were meant to encourage, but often fell flat. They knew fear when they saw it. Some soldiers trembled, others stared into the fire with vacant eyes, and some simply laid back, trying to sleep beneath thin blankets, listening to the distant sound of owls, or the occasional bark of a watchman calling out the hour. Armor and weapons were laid out carefully beside bedrolls, ready for dawn. Boots were placed within reach, helms rested on shields. Even in rest, there was preparation. The smell of leather and steel filled the air, mixed with the scent of smoke, boiled onions, and the faint odor of sweat and damp earth. Near the edges of camp, sentries paced quietly, their silhouettes moving back and forth beneath the moonlight. They strained their ears for any sound that did not belong, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, or the distant clang of a horse's shoe on stone. If battle were to come early, they would be the first to know. But for now, even the enemy was still. Both sides, camped just miles apart, were caught in the same moment of waiting. Time passed slowly, as if the very air were thick with hesitation. The stars overhead wheeled gently across the sky. A shooting star traced a soft arc, unseen by the weary men below. Somewhere, a soldier dreamed of home, of a warm bed, a full belly, a familiar voice, the kind of things that felt impossibly far away. And so the night deepened. It did not roar, it did not scream, it whispered, it waited, it watched. Before any sword was drawn, there was quiet. They came from villages, towns, and remote farmlands, summoned not by ambition, but by duty, pressure, or desperation. The men who made up the bulk of a medieval army were rarely warriors by trade. They were shepherds, cobblers, millers, and sons of poor farmers, ordinary men with calloused hands, crooked teeth, and families waiting back home. They did not wear gleaming armor. Many wore whatever they could afford: a quilted jacket, if they were lucky, perhaps a dented helmet passed down through generations, and a rough tunic beneath it all, bearing the smell of livestock and smoke. The feudal system demanded that vassals provide military service when called upon. For every knight on horseback, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds, of foot soldiers compelled to follow him into the fray. Some were conscripted by lords who rode through their lands demanding names for the levy. Others volunteered because they had little choice. Hunger and taxes were persistent enemies, and war, grim as it was, promised at least regular meals and the possibility, however slim, of coin from spoils or a fallen enemy's purse. There was no standard uniform. A line of infantry could look like a ragged parade. One man in patched wool, another in dyed linen, another shirtless under his mail. Shields, when available, were wooden and often mismatched in size and shape. Few bore a coat of arms. Most were blank, chipped, and scarred, reused again and again, painted over from past wars like fading memories. Weapons were not issued, they were borrowed, scavenged, or crafted by local blacksmiths. Spears were the most common, simple shafts of ashwood tipped with iron, easy to make, easy to replace. Occasionally, a man might carry a falchion or hand axe, tools of labor now turned tools of death. Among them walked the men-at-arms, professionals in the loosest sense, better equipped, sometimes paid, often tasked with keeping order. They resented the peasantry, but relied on their numbers. The peasants, in turn, looked to the men-at-arms for guidance, fearing the chaos of battle more than any shouted order. And then there were the knights, nobles by birth, trained in arms since boyhood. To these men, war was an inheritance. They rode tall horses bred for strength, wore suits of steel that shimmered when clean, and carried long swords that could cost more than a peasant's home. Yet even the knights were not invulnerable. Their armor was heavy, stifling, and difficult to maintain, and in the crush of combat, a lucky blow from a common spear could end their lives just as easily. But these warriors were few. The myth of the medieval army as a tide of noblemen in polished armor is just that, a myth. In reality, the medieval battlefield was overwhelmingly filled with common folk, men who had never seen a castle from the inside, who didn't know how to read or write, who had never ventured farther than the next village until they were marched to war. There were young boys among them, no older than 16, eager to prove themselves, still growing into their limbs. And there were older men, hardened by toil, drafted not because of strength, but because there was no one else left to send. Many were fathers. Some carried keepsakes, small tokens from their families. A lock of hair, a carved piece of wood, a folded scrap of parchment, with a prayer they couldn't read, but had memorized from the lips of a priest. Few among them spoke of courage. Bravery was not the point. Survival was. Most feared what lay ahead. They whispered to one another about injuries they'd seen, about friends who had gone to war and never come back. They asked each other questions no one could answer. Would the battle be quick? Would they be in the front lines? Would the ground be muddy or frozen? Would they live long enough to return home? At night, they laid beside their weapons, not out of readiness, but because they were told to. In the quiet, they stared at the sky or the inside of a tent flap, imagining a different life. Some regretted coming. Some regretted not saying goodbye properly. And a few, very few, were eager, drawn not by duty or reward, but by a restless fire in the blood, the kind that sought danger as a form of meaning. There were no heroes among them yet, just names on a list, faces in the dark, waiting for orders, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. History remembers kings and knights, but it was these men who made up the ranks, silent, scared, and all too human. A knight's preparation for battle was not swift, and it was never simple. It began in the earliest hours of dawn, sometimes even before the first glow of sunlight touched the horizon. The air would still be cold, damp with dew or mist, and inside the noble tents, the process of transformation would begin, the slow and deliberate ritual of turning a man into a machine of war. First came the underlayers. Before any metal touched the skin, the knight was dressed in a padded garment called a gambeson. This thick, quilted tunic was made of layers of linen or wool, stuffed tightly with rags, horsehair, or even bits of straw. It was surprisingly heavy and incredibly hot, but it served an essential purpose. It softened the blow of incoming strikes and prevented the armor from chafing or bruising the flesh. Without it, even a minor jolt in armor could break bone. Over the gambeson came the mail, also called chainmail, a curtain of interlinked iron rings that jingled softly as it was draped across the knight's shoulders. The mail coat, or hauberk, reached to the knees and included long sleeves and often a hood, known as a coif. It was a marvel of medieval craftsmanship, forged link by link, offering protection while still allowing movement. But it, too, was heavy. A full hauberk could weigh as much as 20 to 30 pounds, pulling on the back and shoulders, making every motion more laborious. The knight did not dress himself. That was the role of his squire, a young apprentice, usually a noble-born boy in training to become a knight himself. The squire knew the armor intimately. He had oiled every hinge, polished every surface, and tightened every strap. His hands worked quickly but carefully, lacing, buckling, and adjusting. There was an order to the ritual, a rhythm they both understood. Any mistake could mean death later on. After the mail came the plate. By the later medieval period, this was the armor that defined the knight: the gleaming breastplate, the solid greaves for the legs, the vambraces for the forearms, the cuisses for the thighs, and the gauntlets that protected the hands like cages of steel. Each piece had to be fitted precisely. Some knights had custom-forged armor, shaped to their body like a tailored suit. Others wore hand-me-downs or battlefield salvage, repurposed and reworked to fit. The breastplate alone could weigh 10 pounds, but it offered vital protection to the chest and heart. The backplate balanced the load. Shoulder guards, pauldrons, were added next, overlapping like scales. Then came the helmet, often the final piece. It was claustrophobic, with narrow eye slits and tiny holes for breathing. Visibility was limited. Sound became muffled. Once the helmet was on, the world became dim and enclosed, as if the knight had stepped into a metal tomb. Despite the weight, the full suit of armor was not immobile. A well-armored knight could move with surprising agility, run short distances, mount a horse, and even rise from a fall. But it took strength and endurance, both of which were built over years of training. Younger knights prided themselves on their ability to fight for hours in armor, while older veterans learned to conserve energy, to move with precision, not waste. After the armor, the knight's horse had to be prepared. These were no ordinary animals. They were trained destriers, bred for size and power. Just like their riders, they were armored too. A padded caparison covered the horse's body, sometimes embroidered with the knight's colors or coat of arms. Metal plates or mail were fixed to the head and chest for protection. The squire checked the saddles, the stirrups, and the girths, ensuring every buckle was secure. A knight without his horse was still dangerous, but far more vulnerable. Weapons were laid out carefully, the longsword balanced and sharp, a dagger for close quarters. Some carried maces or warhammers to better fight against armor. A lance, if mounted, was prepared for the initial charge. Long, heavy, and tipped with a point that could pierce both shield and flesh. The knight would often pray over his weapons, or have a priest bless them. He may carry a relic around his neck, or a scrap of cloth from a loved one tucked into his gauntlet. These small tokens were private comforts against the unknowable future. Once fully armed and armored, the knight stood transformed. He was no longer simply a man. He was a symbol of status, of fear, of the ideal of chivalry. His very presence on the battlefield was designed to intimidate. And yet, beneath the polished steel, sweat pooled, muscles ached, breath came short and shallow through the helmet. No armor could guard against fear. As the sun climbed higher, the knight mounted his horse with practiced ease, the squire handing him the reins. Around him, other knights did the same. Some carried banners fluttering in the morning wind. Others silently adjusted straps and stared ahead. There were no cheers, no celebration, just readiness, heavy and solemn. What followed was beyond their control, but for now, they were prepared. Every strap was tightened, every buckle checked, every layer of armor in place. Whatever happened on the field, they had done all they could to become the machines of war their world demanded. And so they waited, still, armored and silent, under the rising sun. The weapons of a medieval battle were as diverse and practical as the men who wielded them. They were not always elegant or beautiful. Most were simple, brutal tools, shaped by the needs of war and the constraints of economy. Every weapon had a purpose, and every soldier carried what he could afford, or what he could scavenge. The most common weapon on any battlefield was not the sword, as popular tales might suggest, but the spear. The spear was the weapon of the people. Cheap to produce, easy to train with, and effective in almost any situation. A sturdy wooden shaft, typically ash, chosen for its balance of strength and flexibility, topped with a sharp iron point. Some spears were short for throwing, others were long and unwieldy, meant to keep the enemy at a distance or hold a defensive line. In the hands of a disciplined formation, spears could repel cavalry charges, stop advancing infantry, and create an impenetrable wall of points. For those who could afford a bit more, the polearm was a preferred choice. These were long-handled weapons with various heads, halberds, glaives, billhooks, each combining the thrusting ability of a spear with the slashing or hooking force of an axe or blade. A halberd, for example, might have an axe blade on one side, a spike on the top, and a hook on the back for pulling riders off horses. The utility of such weapons made them favorites among professional soldiers and town militias. Axes were common among both infantry and lower-ranking soldiers. Many of them were adapted from tools used in daily life. A woodsman might carry the same axe into battle that he used to fell trees. But war axes were also specially made, heavier, with broader heads and reinforced handles. They were designed to cleave through armor and shields. The force of an axe blow could shatter bone even without piercing the skin. Clubs, maces, and flails were the weapons of brute force. These were ideal for crushing blows, especially against armored opponents. A mace, with its weighted head of iron or bronze, could dent a helmet and concuss the wearer within. A flail, consisting of a spiked ball attached to a chain, was unpredictable and difficult to block. These weapons required less precision than a sword, but they were no less deadly. They served as equalizers, tools that made it possible for a peasant to bring down a knight, given the right moment. And then, of course, there was the sword. Iconic, revered, and expensive. A sword was not just a weapon, it was a status symbol. Only the wealthiest soldiers, or those in noble service, carried them regularly. The design varied across time and place. The arming sword was short and manageable, ideal for one-handed use with a shield. The long sword was longer, heavier, and used with two hands. The great sword was taller than a man, swung in broad arcs to break lines. Swords required years of training to master. They were not inherently superior to other weapons, but they carried with them the aura of authority, command, and personal honor. Shields were another essential part of a warrior's equipment. Made of wood, often reinforced with leather or iron, they came in many shapes and sizes, round, kite-shaped, or heater-shaped. A good shield could stop an arrow, deflect a sword, or protect the body from a blow that might otherwise kill. Soldiers often painted them with symbols, religious icons, or the colors of their lord. In the confusion of battle, shields became identifiers, moving beacons of order amidst chaos. Among the most feared weapons on the battlefield were bows and crossbows. Archers began their attack before the armies ever clashed. The longbow, made from yew, could send arrows hundreds of yards with lethal force. English longbowmen, especially, were renowned for their skill and devastating volleys. The crossbow, slower to reload but more powerful, could punch through plate armor. Unlike the longbow, which required years of practice, the crossbow was easier to train with, point and shoot. However, it was heavy and often used with a rest or crank. Both weapons rained death from a distance, and entire ranks could fall before ever meeting the enemy face to face. Arrows themselves were not all the same. Broadheads for unarmored targets, bodkin points for piercing mail. Fire arrows, occasionally, used to ignite structures or cause panic. Quivers were slung over shoulders or tucked at the belt, and archers were trained to move quickly, firing in rhythm with shouted commands. Some soldiers carried daggers, small, easily concealed, and deadly in close combat. These were tools of last resort. When a man was disarmed or trapped beneath another in the mud, a dagger could be thrust into a gap in the armor, under the arm, or through the eye slit of a helmet. Quiet, close, final. Siege weapons were used in larger conflicts: ballistae, trebuchets, and battering rams. But in the typical open-field battle, the weapons were personal, immediate, and brutal. The clash of arms was not elegant. It was dirty, exhausting, and relentless. Weapons were often not chosen. They were inherited, borrowed, or improvised. Some men entered battle with little more than a hammer or a sharpened stake. Others carried relics of older wars, cracked blades, chipped axes, mismatched pieces of rusted iron. For most, the weapon was simply a means to survive, not a badge of heroism. And yet, every weapon told a story, of the man who held it, of the forge where it was born, of the purpose for which it was shaped. These were not instruments of glory, they were instruments of necessity, carried by men who did not wish to die. And when battle began, it was not the shining sword or the elegant spear that mattered most. It was the hand that held it, the grip, the strength, the fear, the will to press forward. That was the true weapon. That was what decided who would walk away. The battlefield was rarely the grand stage we imagine from paintings or films. It was not a clean, open plain framed by mountains or dramatic clouds, with two perfectly formed lines waiting for a trumpet's call. More often, it was an unremarkable patch of land, chosen not for spectacle, but for strategy, convenience, or necessity. A gently sloping hill, a muddy field after rain, a narrow pass between forests, a bend near a river. These were the true stages of medieval war, ordinary, imperfect, and dictated by terrain. Commanders understood that terrain could decide the outcome before a single arrow flew. They looked for high ground, not to appear mighty, but to give their archers an advantage and protect their flanks. Hills allowed for better vision, easier defense, and greater momentum for charges. Marshes and rivers, while hazardous, could be used to funnel the enemy into narrow formations, or to protect one side of an army from being outflanked. Sometimes, neither army had the luxury of choosing ground. Battles could erupt where two forces simply met, on a dusty road, outside a castle gate, or along a narrow bridge. And when they did, there was no rearranging the scene. Troops had to adapt. Trees became cover. Ditches became obstacles. Uneven terrain turned into traps. Rain turned fields into swamps. And every feature of the land became a silent participant in the coming bloodshed. Once chosen, the battlefield had to be prepared, though preparation was minimal by modern standards. Stakes might be driven into the earth to deter cavalry. Defensive ditches could be dug, but only if time allowed. Archers might be positioned behind low walls or behind wagons arranged in a line. In some cases, sharpened wooden stakes would be planted at an angle to form barriers against charging horses. But often, there was barely enough time to form ranks before the enemy approached. There was no grid, no numbered positions. Soldiers lined up according to familiarity, rank, or orders barked by officers. The wealthier knights or mounted soldiers formed the flanks or waited at the rear, ready to charge when the moment came. Infantry stood in the center, shoulder to shoulder, gripping their spears and shields, eyes scanning the horizon. Archers, if present, were placed to the sides or on small rises, positioned to loose their arrows over the heads of their own men. The arrangement of troops could be chaotic. Commanders might have planned neat formations, but in reality, they were shaped by terrain, by panic, and by the sheer difficulty of organizing thousands of men without modern communication. Men shuffled out of place. Some bunched too close, others lagged behind. The line was never perfect. It didn't have to be. In the distance, the opposing army might be visible. A ripple of movement along the tree line, banners fluttering in the breeze, the sun glinting off spears and helms. Sometimes they were silent. Sometimes drums beat slowly to keep time. Occasionally, trumpets or horns were blown, but they were not the gallant signals of legend. They were practical sounds, commands, signals, or warnings. Between the armies lay a stretch of open ground, neutral, untouched, and terrifying. This was the space where the clash would occur. This was the no man's land of the medieval world, too far to shout across, but close enough to feel each other's presence. The waiting could last hours. Sometimes, entire mornings passed with no movement at all, just two bodies of men standing in loose formation, each hoping the other would make the first mistake. In that silence, men shifted their weight. Some adjusted the straps of their armor. Others murmured prayers or looked at the sky. A few tried to joke, their voices strained with nerves. The earth beneath them seemed to hum with a quiet tension. Horses snorted and stamped. Leather creaked. A banner snapped in the wind. And all the while, the battlefield waited, as if the land itself knew what was coming. Weather played a role too. Wind could carry arrows off target. Rain could soak through gambesons and slow movements. Fog could confuse formations. A sudden downpour could turn the ground into thick clay, sucking at boots and hooves alike. Snow, in colder climates, blanketed the terrain in deceptive quiet, hiding rocks, roots, and pitfalls beneath a clean surface. Smells were part of the experience. The pungent stink of sweat and horses, of mud and oil and unwashed bodies. The battlefield was not just seen or heard. It was felt, tasted, inhaled. A visceral space, full of life, just before it would be filled with death. There were no perfect conditions, no ideal setting. A medieval battlefield was shaped by chance, by weather, by movement, and by fear. And once the battle began, that space would change completely. Grass would be trampled into mud. The ground would be stained. Broken weapons and scattered shields would become part of the scenery. Bodies would fall, lines would collapse, and the landscape would remember it all. But before all that, before the first command, the first step forward, the first flight of arrows, there was a stillness, a pause in history. A moment of calm on the patch of earth where men had gathered, many for the first and last time, to fight in a place that would soon become silent again, after everything was said and done. The beginning of a medieval battle was rarely dramatic. It did not start with a charge, nor with shouts of glory or the sudden thunder of galloping horses. More often, it began with a strange kind of silence, a waiting game that stretched out painfully, where both sides stared across the field at one another, hearts racing, hands trembling around weapons, yet no one moved. Commanders hesitated, not from cowardice, but from calculation. The first side to commit risked exposing their plan, their position, and their cohesion. Everyone wanted the advantage. Everyone waited for the other to blink first, and in that stretch of time, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, every man on the field wrestled with the question, when will it begin? And then, almost always, it started with the archers. Archers were not flashy warriors. They wore little armor, often just leather jerkins or padded tunics, and they moved quickly, light on their feet. Positioned slightly forward or to the flanks of the infantry, they readied their bows, longbows, if English, recurve bows in other regions, strung taut, arrows notched and fletched with goose feathers. A shouted command would break the silence. One word, perhaps two, and then the first volley. The sound of arrows in flight is not what one might expect. It is not the metallic ring of steel, but a whispering rush, a sharp flutter through the air, like the breath of the wind concentrated into 1,000 murmurs. Arrows lifted high into the sky in perfect arcs, darkening the light for a moment before raining down upon the enemy. The first volley was almost ceremonial. Rarely accurate, it was intended to provoke, to test, to unsettle. Men on the receiving end crouched behind shields or flinched instinctively. The real damage came from the next wave, and the next as the archers began to adjust their aim, calibrating for wind, distance, and movement. Sometimes both sides had archers, and the air would fill with crossing volleys, arrows flying in both directions, cutting the sky in chaotic dance. Horses screamed if struck. Men fell without sound, quietly slumping to the ground. An arrow in the leg meant pain, in the throat or face, death. The randomness of it was the most terrifying. No amount of skill could shield a man from a well-placed shaft that arrived unseen. The archers kept firing until ordered to stop, or until their quivers were light. They often aimed not at individuals but at masses, clusters of men, lines of spears, anything that moved. They fired rapidly, muscle memory guiding their hands, sweat running into their eyes. Some used simple finger guards, others bore raw welts from repeated draws. It was exhausting work, but in these early moments, they held the power to shift the balance. While the arrows flew, the rest of the army waited. The infantry tightened their formations. Shields were raised, spears were set. Captains walked the lines, barking last-minute instructions or giving steely nods. Knights paced nervously on their horses, gripping lances, their visors still open, Squires made their final checks, strapping gauntlets, handing up spare weapons. The tension in those moments was almost unbearable. Then, slowly, deliberately, one side would advance. It did not look like a charge. It looked like a march, slow, heavy, methodical. Men moved in units, shoulder to shoulder, their weapons held at the ready. They did not run. They did not shout. They stepped forward, one foot after another, into the uncertain space between life and death. As they closed the distance, shouts began to rise, commands, chants, battle cries. Some men yelled to drown out their fear. Others went silent. The space between the armies shrank rapidly, and within moments, the stillness of the morning was shattered by the deep thud of boots, the clank of armor, and the collective roar of adrenaline. This was the second beginning, the true beginning. At a certain distance, the charge began. Trumpets, horns, or drums might signal it. Or sometimes, the instinct of the moment overtook the chain of command. A sudden yell, a single unit breaking into a run, and then the wave began. Men surged forward, feet pounding the ground, spears lowered, swords drawn. The battlefield that had once been quiet erupted into chaos. If cavalry were used, this was their moment. Knights kicked their destriers into motion, hooves tearing into the earth as horses barreled forward. The thunder of a cavalry charge could be felt in the bones. The ground shook. Horses foamed at the mouth, eyes wide with fear and fury. The riders lowered their lances and braced for impact. The initial clash was not elegant. It was not choreographed or clean. It was a collision of bodies, steel, and screams. Spears snapped, shields splintered. The momentum of the charge threw men to the ground. Some were trampled before they could even lift their weapons. Others fell immediately from a blow to the chest or a sword to the head. Dust and blood filled the air, and the lines that had once seemed straight now broke apart into knots and clumps of desperate fighting. The noise was deafening. Not just the clash of metal, but the cries of pain, of rage, of fear, the moans of the wounded, the shouts of officers trying to regain control, the bellows of war horses colliding. It was chaos, and no one truly understood it unless they were in it. And yet, even in this madness, there was rhythm. Fighters moved in patterns, trained instincts guiding their strikes. Shield up, thrust forward, step back, swing left, grip tighter, breathe deeper. They fought not to win, but to survive the next second, the next breath, the next blow. In these brutal minutes, the battle became real. The preparations were over. The waiting had ended. The arrows had flown. The lines had met. Now it was war, in its most raw and intimate form. This was how it began, not with glory, not with triumph, but with fear, noise, and blood. And for many, it was also how it ended. When the armies finally met, when the distance between them vanished in a breath, what unfolded was not the orderly combat of legends or the structured duels of romantic tales. It was chaos in its purest form. The melee was the heart of the medieval battle, and within it, the world shrank to mere feet in any direction. The clash was sudden, disorienting, and overwhelming, consuming every sense with a flood of sound, pain, movement, and fear. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with dozens of other men, your feet slipping in churned earth, your breath tight behind an iron helmet. There is no silence now. There is only the deafening sound of war, the thump of boots against ground, the high-pitched scream of metal against metal, the sharp crack of wood splintering under force, the guttural roars of men in exertion and terror, and the piercing cries of the wounded. Armor groaned under impact. Shields rang like drums when struck. Weapons bit into flesh, sometimes with a sickening softness, sometimes with bone-splitting resistance. Most soldiers did not see their enemy's face. Helmets concealed expressions, visors reduced vision to slits. You swung at shapes, you thrust toward bodies. You hoped your arm was faster, your blade sharper, your shield steadier. For the average infantryman, it wasn't about technique, it was about instinct. You didn't think, you reacted, raise your shield to block, swing low, push forward, repeat, over and over, until your arms were numb or your enemy dropped. Or you did. Visibility was poor. Dust, kicked up by shuffling feet and galloping hooves, filled the air, mingling with smoke from nearby fires and the steam rising from sweating bodies. Blood sprayed, not in elegant spurts, but in messy, warm bursts that coated armor and soaked into gambesons. The ground quickly turned slick and treacherous. Grass disappeared under mud, blood, and the dead. Weapons tangled. A man might lose his sword in another's armor. Axes stuck in shields. Spears shattered after the first impact. Soldiers carried backup weapons, daggers tucked into belts, short blades at their hips. But drawing them in the crush of bodies was difficult. If your main weapon failed, you shoved, kicked, punched with gauntlets. Anything to gain space, to survive a few seconds more. There was no time to help a fallen comrade. If someone tripped or was knocked down, they often never got back up. The mass moved forward and backward like a tide, and those on the ground were swallowed by it, trampled underfoot, pierced by stray weapons, suffocated in the press. Screams for help were common. So was silence. Sudden, chilling silence when the air was driven from lungs or a blade severed a throat. Knights in plate armor fared better in some ways. Their protection gave them a brief advantage in the chaos. Blows glanced off steel, cuts failed to find purchase, but armor was heavy and heat built quickly. Breathing became labored, movement slowed. If a knight fell, it was difficult to rise again, and once on the ground, even the finest suit of armor could become a coffin. Cavalry found the melee particularly dangerous. Once horses entered the fray, they lost their speed advantage. Surrounded, they became easy targets. A spear to the belly, a sword under the neck, a barrage of blows to the legs, and the horse went down, often crushing the rider beneath. War horses were trained to fight, to kick and bite, but in the swirling confusion of battle, even the most disciplined beast could panic. Communication collapsed. Whatever grand plans the generals had imagined dissolved as units broke formation and commanders lost sight of their men. Trumpets and drums became meaningless. Orders were shouted, but the noise drowned them out. Flags were lowered, trampled or obscured by smoke and dust. The battle devolved into dozens, hundreds of smaller fights. Pockets of resistance, duels, clusters of men, hacking at each other with no clear direction. There was no way to tell who was winning in the heat of a melee. Even the commanders didn't know. One side might seem to push forward, only to be driven back moments later. Morale swayed like a flame in the wind. A banner falling could cause panic. A cry of victory could inspire a rally. Rumors raced through the ranks. Reinforcements coming, the enemy retreating, the commander slain. Most of it was false. All of it mattered. Fatigue was the great equalizer. Even the strongest warrior could not swing a sword forever. Arms burned with lactic acid. Breathing became ragged. Limbs trembled. Blows that would have been parried in the first minutes now found their mark. Men dropped their shields, abandoned their weapons, staggered backward in retreat. Sometimes they collapsed where they stood, not wounded, just broken by exhaustion. And yet, within this inferno, there were brief moments of clarity. A glimpse of a familiar face, a successful blow, a sudden break in the line. Time seemed to stretch and contract, with seconds feeling like hours, and hours disappearing in the blink of an eye. The chaos was total, and it was shared. No one, from the humblest foot soldier to the highest noble, was exempt from the storm. The melee was not glorious. It was not heroic. It was dirty, exhausting, terrifying, and tragically human. It stripped away all illusions. In the heart of battle, courage did not look like a knight on a rearing horse. It looked like a man too scared to run, standing his ground because there was nowhere else to go. The warhorse was no ordinary beast. Bred, trained, and conditioned for battle, it was as much a weapon as the knight who rode it. These horses, often referred to as destriers, were large, muscular animals, strong enough to carry an armored man for hours, agile enough to maneuver through uneven terrain, and intelligent enough to respond to commands in the thick of chaos. But despite their training and their armor, they were still living creatures, capable of fear, pain, and panic. To understand the role of horses in medieval battles, we must first imagine the bond formed between knight and steed. A warhorse was not simply an animal selected at random before a campaign. It was raised for years, trained from a young age to withstand the noise and unpredictability of warfare. It learned to trample, to bite, to kick on command. It was desensitized to loud sounds, to flashing metal, to crowds of men. And perhaps most critically, it was taught to obey even under the most terrifying conditions. A rider could steer with knees alone, freeing his hands for a lance or sword. A well-trained destrier could move sideways, rear on command, or charge headlong into a wall of enemy infantry. But for all their strength and training, horses were not machines. They were prey animals at heart. They felt the tremors of approaching battle long before men did. They sensed the tension in their riders. Their ears flicked, their nostrils flared, and their eyes widened as the sounds of war swelled. And when the charge began, when hooves thundered across the earth and the roar of voices rose around them, they were charging into something that by instinct they should have fled from. Mounted knights often formed on the flanks of an army, poised to strike at a critical moment. The charge of cavalry was a weapon of shock. A line of horses bearing down at speed could break an enemy's formation with sheer force. The psychological impact alone was immense. Seeing a wall of iron and muscle racing toward you, hearing the ground shake beneath their hooves, feeling the thunder in your chest before the impact ever came. The moment of impact was violent. A lance couched under the arm of a galloping knight could pierce a shield, a breastplate, or a man clean through. But lances often shattered on the first hit. Riders would then draw swords or maces, continuing the fight at close quarters. The horse, too, became part of the melee. It trampled the fallen. It lashed out with hooves. It shoved its bulk into tight clusters of infantry. The destrier was not passive. It was a partner in the assault. Yet cavalry charges were not invincible. A well-positioned line of spears, held steady by disciplined infantry, could stop a charge dead. Horses were trained to charge into bodies, but not into bristling walls of sharpened wood. Many would veer off instinctively, refusing to impale themselves. Others would rear up, throwing their riders. A single misstep on uneven ground, a fall caused by a hidden pit or a stray arrow, could bring both horse and rider crashing down. Once in the midst of the melee, horses became vulnerable. Surrounded by men on foot, they lost their mobility. Spears were thrust beneath their bellies, axes swung at their legs, and daggers jabbed at unarmored joints. Horses panicked. Some kicked wildly, harming enemies and allies alike. Others froze, trembling with confusion, refusing to move. If a knight fell from his horse in the fray, the horse might bolt, might fight, or might stay close, stomping and whinnying in fright. The loss of a horse could mean death for the rider. An armored knight, dismounted and surrounded, became a slower, heavier target. Without the elevation and speed his mount provided, he lost the advantage that had justified the great expense and training of cavalry in the first place. Squires or fellow knights might attempt to rescue a dismounted comrade, but doing so in the crush of combat was dangerous and often impossible. The armor of horses varied. In wealthier armies, horses wore barding, protective coverings made from cloth, mail, or even plate. The caparison, a long cloth drape, could bear the colours and symbols of a noble house, though it offered limited protection. More robust barding included chamfrons for the head, crinets for the neck, and flanchards for the sides. But full horse armour was expensive and rare. Most horses entered battle with only minimal protection, relying on speed and training over defence. When battles ended, horses, if they had survived, bore the marks of combat as clearly as the men: bleeding cuts, bruised flanks, broken limbs. Many had to be euthanized on the field. Others limped for days, too injured to serve again. The bond between knight and horse made these losses personal. It was not uncommon for a knight to weep over the death of his mount, an animal that had borne him through both ceremony and slaughter. Yet despite all of this, the danger, the fear, the high cost, horses remained central to medieval warfare. They were symbols of status and power, yes, but also essential tools. A mounted knight could travel farther, see more, strike faster, and retreat when needed. Commanders often rode to survey the field, to relay messages, or to flee disaster. Scouts used light horses for speed, couriers relied on them to carry orders, and even pack horses played vital roles, hauling supplies, tents, and weapons across long campaigns. The presence of horses on the battlefield added a layer of complexity to warfare that is often overlooked. They were not just animals. They were instruments of war, trained, trusted, sacrificed. And like their riders, they faced the terror of combat with a kind of quiet courage, charging forward not because they chose to, but because they were asked to. Their hoofprints are among the many forgotten marks left in the mud of history's battles, each one a testament to strength, service, and the shared burden of war. In the confusion and noise of medieval battle, communication was among the first casualties. Before a single sword was drawn, before the armies met in the terrible intimacy of close combat, commanders faced a monumental challenge: how to direct thousands of men across a field where visibility was limited, where the noise drowned out voices, and where the battle's shape could change in minutes. Unlike in modern warfare, there were no radios, no digital maps, no instant messaging systems. Communication on a medieval battlefield was primitive, fragile, and deeply unreliable. Yet it was also vital. Orders began at the top, usually with the commander or noble leading the army. These were men of rank, positioned at a high vantage point, on horseback, on a hill, or behind the front lines, trying to read the battlefield as it unfolded. They might have maps, scouts, and advisors, but in the heat of battle, they depended on sight, sound, and memory. Decisions had to be made quickly and often, based on incomplete or outdated information. Once a decision was made, the real challenge began: delivering that decision to the rest of the army. Messengers, or runners, were the lifeblood of battlefield communication. These individuals, often young and lightly armored, were tasked with carrying verbal or written instructions from one commander to another. They darted between formations, on foot or horseback, weaving through dangerous terrain and under threat of stray arrows or sudden charges. A single message might require traversing the entire width of a battlefield, which could take valuable minutes during which the situation might change dramatically, rendering the message obsolete by the time it arrived. Messages were shouted too, passed from one captain to the next in a fragile chain of command. But shouting had limits. The roar of combat, the clang of steel, and the screams of men created a soundscape so overwhelming that even the loudest voice could be lost. Officers used repetition. Each man would turn and repeat the order to those behind him, hoping it traveled far enough. But this method, like the children's game of telephone, often warped the original message. Hold the line could become fall back by the time it reached the end. To combat this, visual signals were also used. Banners were perhaps the most prominent. Each commander had a standard, a flag or a pennant, often emblazoned with the colors or sigil of their house. These banners were mounted on tall poles and carried by designated bearers who moved through the field so their leaders could be seen. Where the banner went, the men followed. If it advanced, they advanced. If it fell, it could spell panic. The sight of a banner retreating could cause entire units to break formation, believing their leader had been killed or the battle lost. In more organized armies, horns and drums supplemented visual signals. Horn blasts conveyed specific orders: advance, retreat, flank, regroup. The tones and rhythms were known to the soldiers beforehand, drilled into their memory during training. But just as easily, these sounds could be confused, overlapped, or drowned out entirely. Two armies using horns on the same field might send mixed signals, causing mistakes that could decide the battle. Flags were sometimes used in coded systems. Certain colors or movements indicated specific maneuvers. A red flag might signal a charge. A white flag could mean regroup. But even these required that everyone involved understood the code and that the flag could be seen. Smoke, dust, terrain, and the sheer press of bodies often rendered these signals invisible. The physical structure of the battlefield itself further complicated communication. Forests, hills, ravines, and buildings could break lines of sight and isolate entire units. A commander on a hill might see an opportunity or threat that his forward troops could not. Similarly, those in the thick of combat might face collapse, while their leaders believed them to be holding firm. Entire sections of an army might fight in near isolation, unaware of how the broader battle was unfolding just beyond a hill or thicket. Then there was the human factor: fear, fatigue, ambition, and misjudgment. A captain might ignore an order if he believed it suicidal. A panicked runner might deliver the wrong message. A flag bearer might fall. A banner mistaken for another. Officers might lie to their superiors about the state of their troops, hoping to preserve their reputation or buy more time. Miscommunication could be as deadly as any blade. As battles wore on, communication only worsened. Bloodied and disoriented soldiers could barely hear their own thoughts. Leaders fell, horses bolted, horns were lost or broken. Smoke from fires drifted across the field. Nightfall could obscure everything, turning the battlefield into a maze of shadows where friend and foe became indistinguishable. In the confusion, some soldiers fled. Others kept fighting long after the battle was decided. Still others surrendered to the wrong side. And yet, somehow, amidst this confusion, orders were given, received, and acted upon. It speaks to the discipline and adaptability of medieval armies that anything resembling coordination could be achieved at all. Commanders developed elaborate pre-battle plans, contingencies, and fallback signals. Troops were drilled to respond to familiar cues, to follow their unit, to act in unison even when uncertain. Much was left to intuition and experience. Veteran soldiers often led by example, using gestures, eye contact, and presence to convey what words could not. Communication in a medieval battle was not about precision. It was about momentum. It was a tenuous web of intention and reaction, straining at every moment, often breaking. Victory often went not to the side with the best orders, but to the side that adapted fastest when communication failed. In that way, every medieval battle was a test not just of courage, but of improvisation under the most chaotic conditions imaginable. And when the dust finally settled, when the horns fell silent and the banners were still, the question commanders asked first was not, "Did we win?" but, "Where is everyone?" For only then, through scattered survivors and returning messengers, could they begin to piece together the fractured truth of what had actually happened. Among the most crucial yet often overlooked figures in a medieval battle were the standard bearers, the men entrusted with carrying the banners, flags, or standards of their lord, king, or military unit. To the modern mind, a banner might seem decorative or ceremonial, but on the medieval battlefield, it was much more. It was a rallying point, a communication tool, a symbol of identity and morale, and to lose it was not just a logistical inconvenience, it was often a disaster. Banners came in many shapes and sizes. Some were tall, narrow pennons fluttering from lances. Others were broad, square flags mounted on long poles. Each was carefully crafted, dyed in vivid colors, often bearing heraldic emblems, lions, crosses, eagles, fleur-de-lis, dragons, visual shorthand for noble houses, kingdoms, or military orders. In a world where most soldiers could not read or write, these symbols mattered deeply. They told men where to stand, who to follow, and, when confusion reigned, where home was. Before the battle began, the banners were raised high above the assembled troops. Their placement was not random. The banner of a commander marked his position. Lesser lords flew their own standards, each forming a visual constellation of the army's structure. These banners fluttered in the wind as the troops arrayed themselves, creating a strange kind of beauty amid the tension of war. From a distance, a medieval battlefield might resemble a festival or a pageant, bright flags waving, men in colorful surcoats, horns sounding across the hills. But as the armies began to move, the banners took on a more practical role. They became mobile signposts in a storm of motion. In the dust and din of battle, voices vanished. Horns could not be heard, and orders could not travel fast enough. But the eye could still find a banner. A soldier might not know where his captain was or what the latest command had been, but if he could see his lord's banner, he knew where he was supposed to be. It gave him direction. It gave him purpose. It gave him something to focus on when everything else was chaos. The standard bearer's job, therefore, was vital and incredibly dangerous. He did not fight in the conventional sense. His duty was to stay visible, to stand tall even when the arrows flew, to plant the banner firmly into the earth and hold it fast even as the battle surged around him. It required strength to keep the pole upright, courage to remain a target, and unshakable resolve. Archers aimed for banners. Enemy cavalry charged them. Infantry tried to tear them down. A fallen banner could shatter morale in an instant. A soldier might look up, see his banner missing, and assume his leader was dead, his side defeated, and that all hope was lost. For this reason, some standard bearers were selected not just for loyalty, but for their size and bravery. They were often among the strongest men in the army, equipped with chainmail and helmets, but with one hand occupied at all times. In some cases, they were accompanied by a small guard, men assigned to protect them and ensure the banner did not fall. Losing a standard was not just a personal failure, it was a stain on the honor of an entire unit. But there was also great pride in the role. Carrying a banner was symbolic of trust. It meant that the commander believed you would not run, that you would be seen by the men around you and inspire them to hold the line. In battle songs and poems, the banner was often mentioned alongside the king or the hero, a kind of living emblem of the cause for which men fought. The emotional weight of the banner was enormous. Soldiers might rally to it during a retreat, clinging to the last visible point of structure. Others, seeing their own banner under threat, would fight more fiercely to protect it. Conversely, the sight of an enemy standard falling could have the effect of a lightning strike. If the enemy's banner went down, men might believe the tide had turned. They might rush forward with renewed energy, sensing victory in the air. Some of the most iconic moments in medieval battles centered around banners. During the chaos of a rout, one might see a lone standard still flying, surrounded by corpses, held aloft by a dying man who refused to let it fall. In other moments, banners would be captured and paraded as trophies, symbols of conquest and humiliation. To take an enemy's standard was to take their honor. It was proof that their formation had broken, that their defense had failed, and that their leader's authority had been erased from the field. In some battles, more than one banner was used as a deception. A commander might fly false standards to confuse the enemy, create the illusion of a larger force, or hide his true location. Clever use of banners was a kind of visual strategy, a form of battlefield theater where sight mattered more than truth. After the battle, if the army had prevailed, the surviving banners were raised high as a mark of triumph. Soldiers gathered around them. They became the center of prayer, celebration, or mourning. If the army had been defeated, the absence of a banner was often the first confirmation of loss. Families waiting at home would ask, was the banner taken? Did it fall? Its fate told them everything. Today, banners from those long-ago battles survive only in museums, their colors faded, their fabric torn. Yet in their time, they were among the most important and revered objects on the battlefield. They were more than flags. They were identity, communication, structure, inspiration, and soul. To follow a banner into battle was to place your faith in something beyond yourself, and to carry one was to bear the hopes of every man behind you. When a medieval battle reached its breaking point, it often did so not with a clear, triumphant conclusion, but with a slow unraveling, one side collapsing under the pressure, discipline giving way to panic, and men turning from the fight to flee. The end of the fight was rarely as organized as its beginning. In fact, it was often the most chaotic, deadly, and decisive part of the entire ordeal. Contrary to modern assumptions, many medieval battles did not last long. The physical and psychological toll was simply too great. After perhaps an hour or two of intense combat, sometimes even less, one side began to falter. Morale, already stretched thin, snapped. A gap opened in the line. A captain was killed. A banner disappeared. An elite unit broke rank. It didn't take much. Medieval soldiers were keenly attuned to the atmosphere of the battlefield. They watched not just their enemies, but their own comrades, always measuring whether they were winning or losing. The moment doubt took hold, it spread like fire. Once a retreat began, it often became a rout, and a rout was devastating. Soldiers fleeing the field dropped their weapons to run faster. They threw down shields, tore off pieces of armor, discarded helmets. Burdened by fear and exhaustion, they ran without formation, without direction, into forests, across rivers, over hills. Some ran toward friendly strongholds or villages. Others simply ran, hoping to outrun death itself. But the act of fleeing did not ensure survival. In fact, it often invited slaughter. For the victorious side, the moment of rout was the most dangerous for their enemies and the most profitable. A disorganized, defenseless mob was easier to kill than an armed line. Pursuit began immediately. Cavalry, previously held in reserve or recovering from the initial clash, was unleashed. Horses galloped after broken ranks, cutting down the fleeing men from behind. Infantry followed as best they could, stabbing, clubbing, hacking at backs turned in desperation. The brutality of these moments cannot be overstated. Men who had fought bravely minutes earlier were butchered as they ran. There was no honor in this, no glory, only efficiency. But not all commanders allowed this. Some, particularly those who hoped to ransom prisoners or maintain discipline, held back their troops. A frenzied pursuit could scatter even the victors. It was easy for units to become lost, for knights to chase too far and be ambushed by remnants of the enemy. Discipline in victory was difficult to maintain, but crucial in long campaigns. Still, in many battles, especially where hatred or desperation ran deep, the instinct for vengeance overwhelmed any tactical restraint. The men caught in the rout faced more than just swords and lances. They faced nature. In panic, they ran into rivers and drowned. They fell down slopes and were trampled. They hid in marshes and suffocated. Many who weren't killed on the spot were hunted in the days that followed. Scouts scoured the countryside. Local villagers, sometimes out of fear, sometimes for reward, captured fleeing soldiers and turned them over. The fear of retribution, looting, or future rebellion made victors thorough in their mop-up. Not all fled, of course. Some men dropped to their knees and surrendered, holding up empty hands or prostrating themselves in the mud. If they were of noble blood or believed to have value, they might be spared for ransom. Capturing a wealthy knight or baron could bring more wealth than killing him. He would be taken, disarmed, and led away under guard, his life now a bargaining chip. But the lower classes, peasants, levied militia, common infantry, rarely received mercy. They were often deemed expendable. The code of chivalry rarely extended downward. Occasionally, a group of soldiers would make a last stand, forming a tight circle of shields, refusing to flee. These were men who knew they would not be spared, who preferred to die with weapons in hand. They fought until the last man fell, surrounded, overwhelmed, remembered only in the stories of those who watched them disappear under waves of steel and shouting. And then, like a storm that had passed, the field fell still. The end of the fight did not mean the end of death. Wounded men lay groaning in the mud, their cries rising as the adrenaline faded. Some called for priests, for mothers, for water. Others were silent, too far gone to speak. Victors moved among them, sometimes helping, often finishing the dying with a thrust or blow, not out of cruelty necessarily, but out of a cold practicality. There were no medics. There were no field hospitals. A man who could not walk was a burden, and mercy in those times often came with the blade. The battlefield itself was transformed. The vibrant colours of the banners were torn, spattered with blood. The grass was trampled, the soil churned into mud, slicked with gore. Weapons lay everywhere: broken spears, shattered shields, discarded swords. Horses lay with legs twisted, their eyes wide in death. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, blood, urine, and the coppery tang of opened flesh. Ravens and crows circled above. Dogs prowled the edges. Flies began to gather. Amid this ruin, the victors regrouped. Trumpets might sound to signal assembly. Captains shouted roll calls, searching for survivors, reforming companies. Prisoners were tied together or marched away. Looting began almost immediately. Soldiers moved through the bodies, stripping the dead of anything valuable: boots, belts, rings, armor. Corpses were rolled over with a boot, looted, and left face down in the dirt. Even friends were not always spared. The dead could not protest, and supplies were limited. Leaders surveyed the aftermath from horseback, their expressions unreadable. A battlefield was not a place for celebration, it was a place of reckoning. They counted the fallen, they gave brief orders. If a victory had been won, it came at a cost. If they had lost men, they were noted. If a commander or noble had perished, messengers were sent to inform families or lords. Often, the true scale of victory or defeat was not understood until days later, when all scouts returned and the missing were accounted for. And so the fight ended, not with cheers or banners raised high, but with silence, exhaustion, and the grim ritual of death's accounting. For the men who had survived, there was no certainty, only the knowledge that they had endured, that they were still breathing while others lay still. The battle was over, but the war, in most cases, was not. Another march would come, another fight, another field to stain. For now, though, the swords were lowered, the dust settled, the birds descended, and the world continued on. When the last cries faded and the victors stood alone on the field, the true horror of a medieval battle began to reveal itself. The fight may have ended, but the aftermath stretched long into the day, and sometimes into days after. The battlefield was not quickly cleared, nor neatly resolved. What remained was a landscape twisted by violence, littered with corpses, stained by blood, and heavy with the groans of the wounded and the silence of the dead. All around, the dead lay where they had fallen, some on their backs, staring at the sky as if still trying to understand what had happened. Others curled into themselves, caught in their final act of desperation or pain. The bodies were not spaced apart like pieces on a game board. They were tangled together, stacked where men had died in groups, limbs bent at unnatural angles, faces twisted with fear, anger, or peace. Some were stripped already. Others still wore the armor they had died in, their weapons frozen in their grip. For many, there was no dignity in death, only the quiet stillness that comes after a storm. The wounded were scattered among them, caught between life and death. Their cries echoed across the ruined field, pleas for help, gasps for air, or soft, incoherent murmurings. Many could not move. They clutched wounds packed with dirt, gaping injuries where the body no longer held shape. Arrows protruded from legs, torsos, faces. Arms were crushed, legs severed. Some bled slowly, waiting for the end. Others screamed and thrashed, desperate to live, even as the color drained from their skin. There were no medics, no surgeons waiting with clean linens and salves. There were no stretchers or carts lined up to rush the wounded to safety. Treatment was a privilege afforded to the few. Nobles and knights, if found alive, might be carried away by squires or servants, their wounds hastily bound with torn cloth and prayers whispered over them. A broken limb might be splintered, an arrow might be pulled out if the man could bear the pain. But for most, there was no help. Their wounds were left to fester or finish them. Priests, if present, moved slowly through the carnage. Some gave last rites, others muttered prayers as they stepped over broken bodies. There was little they could do but offer a final comfort, a soft word in the name of God before the breath faded. Sometimes the wounded asked them to pass messages to family, names, confessions, final wishes. The priests listened, nodded, and kept walking. Survivors of the victorious army began their grim work. Looting the bodies was expected. Armor was expensive, and few could afford to leave it behind, even if soaked in blood. Swords, shields, daggers, anything of value was taken. Soldiers searched pockets and belts, peeled rings from fingers, yanked boots off corpses. Sometimes they took food or water flasks. Sometimes they took trinkets, tokens of luck, scraps of cloth, personal keepsakes. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. War was harsh, and spoils were part of the reward. Among the looters moved the quiet, unseen workers of war, those assigned to bury the dead. If the battle was small, or if the victors were especially organized, a burial detail might be formed. Shallow graves were dug, often in long trenches. The dead were dragged into them, sometimes with care, more often simply dumped. Priests might bless the burial, but not every body received one. Not every trench was deep enough, and not every soldier was found. Some were buried where they lay, others were left above ground to rot, scavenged by animals, or eventually consumed by the returning earth. Identifying the dead was difficult. Helmets concealed faces. Blood and mud distorted features. If a man carried no seal, no ring, no distinct mark, he was anonymous. Lords might send heralds to search for fallen knights, hoping to recover bodies for proper burial, to report to families, or to recover valuable arms and armor. For the common soldier, there were no records. No names were written down. No letters were sent home. He vanished into the field, into the mass of unmarked corpses that lined the earth. The smell of the battlefield grew worse by the hour. Blood soaked the soil, mixing with sweat, excrement, and the stomach-turning scent of opened bodies. Flies gathered in thick clouds. Ravens descended, pecking at open wounds, tearing at soft flesh. Dogs, wild or abandoned, roamed the edges of the field, emboldened by the absence of threat. Scavengers of every kind emerged, not all of them animals. Local villagers sometimes came to the battlefield, picking through the remains. They searched for coins, weapons, and even clothing. A helmet could be cleaned and sold. A good pair of boots might fetch a price in the next town. Some looted out of need, others out of grim habit. And always there was risk. Unexploded tempers among the victors, or soldiers who viewed them as thieves. The land itself bore the scars. What had once been pasture, farmland, or open meadow was now torn and blackened. Grass was gone, trees splintered, earth compacted and soaked. Waterways near the battlefield might run red for days, thick with blood and runoff. Farmers, if they returned, might avoid the area for seasons. The soil, poisoned by death, yielded nothing. Crops would not grow. Animals refused to graze. Emotionally, the aftermath lingered longest in the minds of the survivors. Some sat alone after the battle, unable to speak, their eyes hollow. Others recounted what they had seen, their voices shaking. Nightmares followed them. Guilt haunted them, not just for killing, but for surviving. They remembered the faces of men they had fought beside, now gone. They remembered what it felt like to be certain of their own death, and then to walk away. Songs would eventually be written about the battle, full of valor and honor. Poems would name the nobles and glorify the cause. Chronicles would mark the date and location, perhaps the name of the commander or the turning point of the war. But none of these would capture the quiet horror of the aftermath, the stillness, the stench, the weight of what was lost and what remained. Because long after the weapons were lowered and the armies had marched away, the battlefield remained. It remembered. On the battlefield, after the clash and chaos had subsided, after the cries of the dying had grown faint, there remained a quieter and often more harrowing truth: the wounded. They were the ones left behind, caught between the two absolutes of life and death, hovering in a realm of suffering that few could escape and even fewer would ever forget. In the medieval world, to be wounded in battle was not a simple matter of endurance. It was a trial of survival without mercy, medicine, or much hope. There were no medics in the modern sense. There were no surgical tents with trained professionals moving efficiently from one patient to the next. No antiseptics, no anesthesia, no sterile tools or clean linens. A wounded soldier could expect little more than rudimentary aid, if any at all. What care he received depended entirely on who he was, where he had fallen, and whether someone thought it worth the effort to save him. Nobles and knights stood the best chance. If found alive, A squire or servant might drag them from the field, struggling with the weight of their armor, hauling them by the straps of their breastplate or the edge of their surcoat. They would be taken to a camp or nearby shelter, laid out on a rough table or a bed of straw, and examined by a barber surgeon, a man whose tools were as likely to cause death as to prevent it. These surgeons were not trained in anatomy as we understand it. Their knowledge was based on experience, tradition, and sometimes superstition. They might cauterize a wound with a hot iron. They might amputate a crushed limb with a saw. They might pour wine into a gash to cleanse it, whisper a prayer, and move on to the next man. Pain was a constant companion. There was no escape from it. A man might be held down by others while his wound was cut open or stitched with thick, curved needles. Biting on leather or a stick was common. Screaming was expected. Passing out was a blessing. And infection was almost inevitable. Wounds festered quickly in the heat of summer or the damp cold of spring. Flies laid eggs in open flesh. Fever set in. Red lines crept up limbs. The wounded man might linger for days, hallucinating, shivering, begging for water or death. For the common soldier, the outlook was even worse. There were no servants to carry him, no surgeon to attend him. If he could walk, he walked. If he could crawl, he crawled. If he could not move, he waited. He might be found by fellow soldiers scavenging the field, who might give him a drink, offer a word of comfort, or, more often, pass him by. Supplies were limited. Resources were scarce. Saving one man could mean losing another. It was not cruelty. It was a calculation made over and over in every war. Some of the wounded tried to treat themselves. They tore strips of cloth to bind gashes, used mud or herbs in desperate hope, or tried to splint broken limbs with branches. Others prayed, clinging to rosaries or holy medals, whispering names of saints they hoped would hear. A few were carried by villagers, loaded into carts pulled by oxen, jolting painfully over every bump and stone in the road as they were taken to a monastery or healer. Monasteries were the only places where the wounded might find consistent care, though it was far from ideal. Monks tended the injured with gentleness and devotion, but they were not doctors. Their treatments relied on herbal remedies, poultices, and spiritual intervention. A wound was as likely to be treated with a prayer as with a salve. Bleeding was stopped, when possible, with pressure and cloth. Bone fractures were wrapped in linen soaked in egg whites or vinegar. Herbal mixtures were applied to burns or cuts, made from plants like yarrow, comfrey, or lavender. But all of it was guesswork. Some monks believed that illness and injury were punishments for sin. Others treated the body with care but saw the soul as the true patient. And always, there was the smell, pungent, sickly, unforgettable. The smell of sweat, blood, rot, and despair. The wounded lay in makeshift shelters or in open-air tents, flies crawling over their faces, wounds dripping onto straw that quickly became matted and black. Moans filled the air, rising in waves, quieting only when sleep came, or death. Not all wounds were visible. Many soldiers carried injuries that no one could see, and that no treatment could heal. Hearing loss from the roar of combat, eyes damaged by smoke, dust, or flash. But worst of all was the damage to the mind. Some men survived with barely a scratch on their bodies but were never the same. They flinched at sudden sounds. They woke screaming. They withdrew from others, refusing to speak, staring at nothing for hours. These were the haunted, the ones who had seen too much, felt too much, survived when so many others had not. They bore invisible wounds that lasted a lifetime, if they lived that long. There was no word then for trauma, no concept of psychological care. Their silence was misunderstood. Their fear was mocked. Some were dismissed as cowards. Others became violent, unpredictable, or numb to the world. In villages and towns, they were sometimes shunned. In castles, they were tolerated, until they weren't. A man broken by battle might spend the rest of his life in a small cottage, visited only by the memory of what he had endured. And yet, even in this bleak aftermath, there were flickers of humanity. A squire staying beside his wounded knight, refusing to sleep until the fever broke. A monk singing to a dying soldier as he cleaned his wound. A mother searching the battlefield for her son, whispering his name through tears and wrapping his body in a cloak when she found him. These were quiet acts of grace amid the horror. But they did not change the truth. To be wounded in a medieval battle was a sentence of suffering. Survival was rare. Recovery was partial. Scars, both seen and unseen, were permanent. The sword might miss the heart, but it never missed the man. In the end, those who lived carried the weight of their wounds for the rest of their days. Long after the banners had been folded, the trumpets had gone silent, and the battlefield had grown quiet once more. Victory on the battlefield was rarely clean, rarely noble, and almost never the end. When the fighting stopped and one side stood triumphant, what followed was not celebration, but a grim process of claiming, sorting, and surviving. The victors, though spared the worst of the loss, still faced exhaustion, injury, and the overwhelming task of restoring order to the wreckage they had helped create. And among the very first tasks, often before burying the dead or tending to the wounded, was looting. In the medieval world, looting was not only expected, it was part of the economy of war. Soldiers were rarely well paid. Their compensation came not just in coin or rations, but in what they could take from the battlefield. Weapons, armor, food, clothing, horses, and coins, all were up for grabs. The battlefield was seen as a harvest, grim and grotesque, where spoils were gleaned from the fallen. The defeated were not merely enemies vanquished. They were sources of wealth, of opportunity, of reward for the risk just taken. As soon as it was clear the battle was won, the victorious soldiers fanned out across the field. Their gait was slower now, heavy with fatigue, weapons hanging loosely in hand or sheathed altogether. Many still bled, limped, or bore bruises. But the hunger for reward drove them onward. They moved among the corpses and the dying, bending low to strip rings from fingers, unfasten buckles, and tug boots from limp legs. Armor was removed with practice and speed. Mail hauberks pulled over heads, breastplates unstrapped, helms lifted from crushed skulls. The dead did not resist. The dying rarely could. Gold and silver were rare but precious. Purses were cut from belts, necklaces yanked free, signet rings pried from swollen knuckles, sometimes with the aid of a knife. A noble's body was a prize, often covered in finely wrought armor, rich fabrics, and ornaments of value. Even broken weapons were worth something. Iron could be reforged, hilts reused, blades repaired. Arrows were retrieved by the handful. Horses, if they still lived, were claimed immediately. Saddles, bridles, and harnesses were all taken. Some looters brought carts. Others used stripped shields to carry goods. There was an etiquette of sorts, but it was fragile. Higher-ranking officers were often allowed first choice. Captured banners, enemy standards, or important relics were reserved for the commanding lords, who would display them as trophies or use them as bargaining chips. Certain items, especially those linked to religion, were sometimes left untouched, either out of reverence or fear. But more often, the line between sacred and spoils blurred. Even the holy was looted if it glittered enough. Violence could break out among the victors. Disputes over who found what, who claimed which piece of armor, who had the right to loot a particular noble's body. These arguments could turn deadly. Tempers, frayed by the ordeal of battle, exploded over small treasures. Commanders sometimes had to intervene, dividing spoils according to rank, or punishing those who violated agreed-upon rules. But the battlefield was large. Most looting went unobserved, and theft among comrades was not uncommon. For some, looting was done not with greed, but with grim necessity. Food was taken from the dead because the army needed to eat. Water flasks, dry bread, pieces of smoked meat, all helped sustain those who had survived. Cloaks were taken from corpses to wrap around the living. Shoes were swapped out. Even socks, lice-ridden and damp, were stripped from one man and pulled onto another. Comfort had no place here, only survival. And yet, in this frenzy of looting, there was a strange quiet. The clamour of battle was gone. The looters worked quickly, but not loudly. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the clink of metal, the soft grunt of effort as bodies were rolled over and armour wrestled free. Occasionally, a soldier spoke, a muttered curse, a sigh of relief, a comment about the quality of a sword or the weight of a purse. Laughter was rare. Victory brought no joy, only a numb, weary sense of completion. Not all loot was claimed immediately. Larger items, like wagons, tents, or siege equipment, were catalogued later. If the battle was part of a siege, the looting might extend into the defeated town or castle. And there, the real pillaging could begin. Homes were ransacked, doors smashed, storehouses emptied. If civilians were present, they were often at the mercy of the victors. Some were killed. Others were enslaved. Women, in particular, faced horrific treatment. Rape was a common and largely unpunished crime in the wake of a medieval victory. Looting extended not just to objects, but to bodies and lives. The shame of conquest stained even the proudest victories. Commanders might try to restrain their men, especially if the location held strategic value. An intact town was more useful than a burned one, but restraint was difficult to enforce. A hungry, exhausted, blood-stained army was not easily calmed. Promises made before battle of discipline, order, mercy were often forgotten. War dehumanized not only its victims, but its victors, and the frenzy of looting was one of its darkest reflections. After the first wave of looting, the spoils were divided. Markets sprang up almost immediately. A soldier might sell a fine dagger to a fellow for a few coins, or trade armor for food. Merchants who followed armies, camp followers, peddlers, blacksmiths, appeared with carts and open hands. The detritus of battle became currency. A single ring might buy a month's supply of bread. A stolen brooch might pay for a prostitute's companionship or a priest's absolution. Meanwhile, the commanders gathered their share. Taxed from the looters, taken from the high-born dead, demanded as rightful due. The spoils funded further campaigns, paid debts, bought horses, or were sent home in letters of victory. In this way, the battle's outcome reached far beyond the field. Villages prospered or suffered based on the success of their sons and lords. A man who brought home silver might rise in standing. A lord who returned with enemy standards gained prestige and power. But for the average soldier, the loot was more personal. It was a way to make meaning out of suffering. A trinket taken from a fallen foe might become a lucky charm. A fine blade might be kept for the next battle. Some kept items from their comrades. Small things, reminders of those who had died beside them. These became memorials, carried silently from one battlefield to the next. And then, after days of looting and sorting, the battlefield slowly emptied. The victors moved on, chasing the retreating enemy or returning home. The spoils were packed, the wounded were left behind, or taken as they could be, and the dead began to decay in silence. What had once been a roaring field of battle was now a graveyard, stripped bare. Victory was not clean. It was not noble. It was a cold, practical state of being, the moment when one side had power and the other did not. And in that moment, the victors took everything they could, because they knew the next time they might not be the ones left standing. Most medieval battles, though once ferocious and earth-shaking to those who fought in them, slipped quietly into obscurity. The clash of swords, the cries of men, the raising and falling of banners, these were not events carved permanently into the walls of time. Instead, they faded into memory, and from memory into silence. The battlefield itself, once a theatre of fear and fury, was reclaimed by nature. Grass regrew over the blood-soaked ground. Trees rose where men had once fallen. Birds returned to sing in branches that had watched slaughter. The land forgot, and so, often did history. Only the greatest, most politically significant battles were written into the chronicles. Only the conflicts where kings died or kingdoms shifted tended to be remembered with clarity. But even these were usually recorded by monks far from the field, relying on hearsay, guesswork, or the biased reports of noble victors. The ordinary soldier, the peasant levied from a village, the blacksmith who picked up a spear, the baker's son who died in the mud. His name was not remembered. His story was not told. He vanished with the wind, one soul among thousands. Even when a battle was remembered, it was rarely remembered accurately. Details warped over time. Numbers were exaggerated. Victories were polished to seem more righteous. Defeats were reinterpreted as noble sacrifices. Those who told the stories, scribes, poets, bards, did so for patrons who paid them, for churches who needed a moral, or for courts that desired glory. Thus, myth slowly replaced fact. A skirmish became a decisive clash. A brutal massacre became a holy war. A simple, frightened soldier became a hero or a villain, depending on who wrote the tale. The terrain itself changed. Villages that once lay near the battlefield were abandoned, renamed, or rebuilt elsewhere. Roads were diverted. Rivers shifted course. Farmsteads sprang up over burial mounds. Graves sank and were forgotten. Centuries later, ploughmen would find rusted swords tangled in tree roots, or skulls with cracks from axe blows unearthed by a sudden storm. But they did not always know what they were. A bone might be reburied, a coin pocketed, a rusted dagger tossed aside. The connection to the past had frayed too far. Occasionally, legends lingered. Local people might remember a haunted field where lights flickered at night or strange mists rolled in too fast. Children might be warned not to play near certain old stones. Farmers might avoid ploughing over spots where horses refused to tread. They could not always say why, but the feeling remained. The memory of pain and violence seemed to seep into the soil itself, preserved not by ink and parchment, but by silence, superstition, and shadow. For the survivors of the battle, those who made it home, remembrance was deeply personal. A scar on the leg, a limp, a recurring dream. Some refused to speak of it, others spoke of nothing else. Veterans might gather around a hearth to recall the day the sun rose red, the ground shook with hoofbeats, and the sky was filled with arrows. But their words rarely reached beyond the next generation. Grandchildren forgot, stories dulled, and so, even the oral memories slipped away. For some, forgetting was intentional. Lords might downplay a costly victory or bury the embarrassment of a near defeat. They had reputations to maintain, lands to secure, alliances to protect. Chroniclers under their patronage were encouraged to highlight valor, suppress cowardice, and gloss over atrocities. A massacre became a necessary purge. A retreat became a tactical maneuver. The truth, already lost in the fog of war, was further buried under layers of political necessity? And what of the unknown battles? The ones never chronicled at all? There were many. Skirmishes over borders, raids between rival lords, local feuds that escalated into small-scale bloodshed. These left no mark on the official record. They happened in forests, in mountain passes, on rocky coasts, or forgotten fields. Those who died were buried in shallow graves or left to the elements. Their names were never carved in stone, their sacrifices never sung. Yet even these forgotten battles shaped the world. Each death had a ripple effect. A village lost a father. A mother became a widow. A farm went untended. A trade was never passed on. The economy of a region shifted. The next harvest suffered. A child grew up without guidance. A family moved elsewhere, altering the fabric of a town. History is not made only by kings, but by the accumulation of countless small losses. And every forgotten battle was rich with such unseen consequences. In rare instances, archaeology brings these battles back into the light. A buried sword is found, perfectly preserved in peat. A mass grave is discovered beneath the floor of a forgotten chapel. Forensic analysis reveals trauma patterns, wound types, traces of weapons long since vanished from written accounts. Slowly, patiently, a picture is rebuilt. A picture not of glory, but of struggle. Not of strategy, but of survival. These excavations remind us that the past is not gone, only hidden. The earth remembers what we do not. Perhaps the most sobering truth is this: for every famous battle remembered today, there are 100 others lost. For every name etched into history books, there are 1,000 more erased by time. And yet, the blood they shed was no less real. The terror they felt was no less acute. The lives they lived, the futures they hoped for, the families they missed, all as vivid and precious as those of any hero in legend. So when we speak of medieval battles, let us remember not only the victors and their banners, not only the kings and their glory, but also the unnamed, the forgotten, the ones who fought, fell, and faded into the quiet folds of history. Because even if their stories were never told, their existence shaped the world we now walk. And the silence that follows their memory is not empty, it is sacred.